Okay, welcome. So I'm going to give you a friendly introduction to psychology, biopsychology. It's a complex subject because there's so much information provided that it's difficult for the student to understand uh, in terms of combining all that information together. So I'm going to attempt to give a good, concise explanation of what is biopsychology by providing an example. All right. So biopsychology is often confused with behavioral neuroscience. They are actually similar in terms of behavioral neuroscience. So if you want to think about biopsychology, think about how biology explains behavior. And biology, think about the brain and how it can influence behavior such as cognition, what you're thinking at this moment of time, for example, language, walking, sleeping, breathing, all these kind of behaviors. Emotions, for example, can also be influenced by biology. So behavioral neuroscience is known as biological psychology. It's an application of principles of biology to the study of physiological, genetic, and developmental mechanisms of behavior in humans and other animals. So biological aspects, what do I mean in terms of biopsychology? Well, you have the brain, you have neurons and nervous system. So this neurons and nervous system, they allow communication of a signal which allows the brain to move body parts. So for example, if you feel something on your arm, how does that signal get to the brain? Well, the neurons allow that to happen. There's cells in their body connected in the with nerve fibers, and they communicate the signal to the brain. Neurotransmitters, they allow the signal to be transmitted between the neurons, right? And so these are chemical signals. And so here you can see two neurons communicating with each other, and then the neurotransmitter is being released. Here you have hormones also are an important component of a biological aspect, right? So the pituitary gland releases growth hormones. So think about when you were 12 years of age and suddenly you underwent a growth spurt, right? And so that was a result of the pituitary gland releasing growth hormones. Melatonin, for example, from pineal gland is important when you want to sleep. For example, melatonin might be inhibited. Adrenal gland release of cortisol, right? Allows you to when stressed, there's a high level of stress, cortisol is released. So biopsychology, anatomy of the brain, sensory systems, evolution of the brain function, neurotransmitter, transmission, the brain itself. So when I teach students cognitive neuroscience, topics in behavioral neuroscience, I often like to give examples. And one good example is thinking about when someone touches your arm, on your arm, what happens? What do you think happens in your body? How is that signal sent to the brain? Or is it sent to the brain? What are cases when it doesn't happen, like in a case of a reflex? So let's take the case of a spider on your arm, which certainly is something which is fearful for some people, but not for other people. But what action does happen, and how can we think about it? So let's think about it. You have a sensory receptor here, it feels a spider, you feel the spider on your arm, sensory receptor is there in your arm. It has to translate that touch into an electrical signal. And so the electrical signal will go through the sensory afferent nerve, which is entering into the body, and it goes through the posterior root of the spinal cord, and either it just doesn't go to the brain. So that would be like a reflex, right? And you just flick your arm. Well, let's think about it as a reflex pathway. And so the neuron will cause a synapse onto another neuron, which is in a fiber. The neurons are connected in fibers. And then that signal will then go onto a muscle, and come out. And so here you have the effector nerve, and then the muscle then moves the arm. The other way is that the signal would go from the sensory receptor, will go to the brain. So it goes through the spinal cord as expected, but instead of going in a reflex pathway, it goes up to the brain. And so here you have the brain, occipital cortex, probably over here. That's let me point that out. The occipital cortex here, and then it would then occipital cortex would process the visual information associated with the spider. So that's a spider. What type of spider? And then I'll go to the parietal over here, which more about the space. Where is the spider located? And then I'll go to the frontal premotor cortex, which allows you to plan your motor movement. In this case, shaking off your arm in a specific direction to remove the spider. And so the signal goes to the down from the brain and then synapses onto the nerve here and onto the motor effector nerve and then onto the muscle which shakes off the spider. So the effector is because it's an exit, right? The signal is exiting out of the body. The parts of the nervous system. And so this leads us to the parts of the nervous system, divisions of the nervous system. I've actually talked about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is here in this image here. If you look at this image, it has the peripheral nervous system in yellow. And so all these nerve fibers here, which contain neurons, connect to the spinal cord and the brain. So the peripheral nervous system allows us to move our body parts because the nerve fibers connect to the spinal cord and to the brain. So forms communication system between the central nervous system and the body parts. And the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Specifically, in terms of removing the spider, that's a conscious movement. You're aware of it, right? That's the somatic system here. It's a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, which allows us to move and control muscles throughout our body. So that's a conscious act, but our autonomic system is actually a reverse of that. It's the opposite. It's unconscious. So you're not actually aware of how many heart rate beats you're feeling at this moment of time, right? It's an unconscious act, and I'll be talking about later again about the autonomic system. But it's interesting how this is different in terms of the somatic. It's a more conscious feeling associated with the somatic system, whereas autonomic, it's an involuntary feeling. To understand the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, you have to understand about the neuron, right? The neuron consists of axons, which are connected to dendrites. The dendrites receive the signal that propagate through the axon. And in order to propagate across the axon, they have to be action potential, at which there's a threshold, and then you have a neural impulse, which is transmitted, and then neurotransmitters are released from the postsynaptic, presynaptic terminal of the dendrite of the neuron, and then that neurotransmitter binds onto receptor sites of the axon terminal of another neuron, and that signal then propagates onwards. So that's the propagation of the signal, right? Spinal cord, it's another important component, right? In order for the signal to reach the brain, it has to go through the spinal cord. And what is also interesting is that different nerve fibers in the spinal cord, or different sections of the spinal cord, are connected to different body parts. And so that's a critical part of the peripheral nervous system. So for example, if there's a serious car accident someone experiences, part of the lumbar section is fibers are affected, the foot cannot move, for example, or parts of the body cannot, the person cannot move. And so in this case, we have this picture here of this person uh, damage to a lumbar part. He cannot move his leg, so he has to undergo rehabilitation to restore function. The brain itself is another important component of the central nervous system. it is involved. So you have the frontal part, the parietal, the temporal lobe, and the occipital. So for example, the occipital lobe is important for processing visual information. So there you have it. You feel a spider on your arm. What are the processes which is occurring? We can have two pathways which occur. So this is our somatic system, which we have been talking about, right? So you can think about the somatic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system that is responsible for carrying motor and sensory information both to and from the central nervous system. Here are some other examples you can think about. Examples are really good and they're very helpful. So I encourage students to not memorize too much, but to use examples. So here, think about a knee-jerk reflex. You go to the doctor and he's testing your reflexes of your knee, right? Hits the knee with a small hammer on the kneecap, and you feel this. It's not a conscious act, but you get this reflex. And why does this? How does this reflex happen? Well, you feel the touch of the little hammer on the kneecap. The signal goes to the spinal cord from the afferent neuron and then exits in a reflex arc back to the motor neuron here and causes you to move your knee. Another way to think about it in the somatic system is from the brain right here. Here you have a person who sees a glass of water, right? And he processes that visual information of the water, and that sensory information then goes from the brain to the motor input nerve fibers, which synapses on the muscle of the bicep, which causes the hand to move to the glass of water to pick up the water to drink, right? So the peripheral nervous system also has an autonomic nervous system, which I alluded to before when I was talking about the divisions uh, of the peripheral nervous system. You have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So the sympathetic division is more about expends the energy reserves at times of high emotional fear or stress. So think about you have an impending final exam coming up. Suddenly, 5 minutes before the exam, your heart rate is very high. Um, it's a high heart rate. You're not able to eat, and so there's inhibition of digestion. Well, your sympathetic division is at play. It's like a fight or flight part of your sympathetic division system. The parasympathetic is more after the exam is complete. You can now relax, and so your body now you can digest, eat something, eat a snack, you feel hungry, and so forth, right? And your heart rate is reduced. So that's the parasympathetic division. Think about this example. You're out with your friend and you're watching a favorite television show and you are in a relaxed state. And so that's the active parasympathetic system. Your heart rate is low, everything feels good. Suddenly, your friend tells you there's an exam tomorrow. And what happens is your sympathetic system gets activated. So think about it as like a light switch. And so it all gets activated, sympathetic system. Your heart rate increases. Here's an example here. Your heart rate increases, digestion is inhibited, and your pupils are dilated. Whereas when after the exam, well, what happens is your digestion, you can eat now. You feel hungry, your heart rate is decreased also, and your pupils are constricted. Right. So what is the take-home message? Well, the take-home message is really when you think about a complex subject such as biopsychology or behavioral neuroscience, and you think about the concepts in there, you need to think about examples, scenarios, and relate it to concepts in biopsychology or behavioral neuroscience. And there are scenarios you can think about. I gave you one in terms of a feel of a touch of a spider on your arm, but you can think about Well, placing your hand accidentally on a hot oven, or touch of someone's hand on your arm or face, what would you do then? What would be the experience in your body? There are some other questions to consider. How does evolution, genetics, play a role in human beings' fear of spiders? How is a reflex, the shake of a spider, different from what you think consciously about shaking of a spider? Can you think of other real life experiences that you can apply your knowledge of biopsychology? Thank you. I hope you now have a better understanding of the importance of biopsychology and how it is applied to understanding real life experiences.